The restaurant smelled of lemon oil and garlic, warm and familiar in the way places where people celebrate things always are. Edison's had exposed brick and Edison bulbs, the kind of place that buys its atmosphere as carefully as it buys its salmon. Laughter folded over laughter at the long table, and every face seemed to belong to a world I no longer inhabited. Friends clustered around Ida like birds around a feeder, bright, irritable, impatient for the next morsel of entertainment. She sat at the head, the exact center of gravity in a room that already leaned in her direction. I walked in with an envelope folded so many times it had the softness of a well-loved coin. I'd practiced my line on the train, in the taxi, in the mirror that morning. Simple, proud, not needy. I carried the small, enormous thing I had been saving for. 2 months of penny pinching, skipped lunches, late returns of library books. $4,200, Hawaii, 7 days, oceanfront. It looked ridiculous on paper, almost like a joke. 2 rectangles of glossy cardboard printed with palm trees and flight numbers. It was everything I could give, and every time I believed that, a small, honest part of me relaxed. "Dad made it," Ida announced, standing when I came into the room, as if she had been waiting to count me in her life's tally. Her smile ignited a dozen automatic smiles around her, polite and reflexive. I slid into a gap someone had made with a shift of their knee. The hostess's gesture toward our table had been vague enough that I might have turned around and left, and none of them would have noticed. But I didn't. I walked in. I sat down. Wallace sat to Ida's left, the comfortable rightness of him obvious as a brand, an expensive shirt, precise hair, a hand that belonged on the back of a chair, a laugh that sounded practiced where it needed to be loud. When he reached for his wine, the light hit the metal band of his watch and flashed like an accolade. He was everything Ida liked, a polished problem solver, neat contradictions folded into a person you could hold. We, appetizers. Conversation orbited the table in polite eccentricities. Someone, Maria, asked Ida about the presentation she'd been complaining about last week. Someone else made a joke about a coworker who bought a car he couldn't park. Ida told the story with the kind of voice that leaves no room for interruption. She gestured across the plate, animated and exact. Her friends laughed exactly when she expected them to. I waited for a pause that felt right. You would think, if you had been me, if you had stood at the distance I had for the last few years, that you could recognize the proper moment for a small, deliberate kindness. There was never a moment for it, not really. Life had rearranged itself into a series of micro-appointments and apologies. Birthdays had become lists of needs and tolerable performances. That night, I wanted to be special, enough to be remembered. I placed the envelope on the table in front of my plate and kept my hands flat beside it. The paper felt warm. My fingers left little crescents of oil from the taxi seat. Etta glanced down only for a second, the way one might glance at a receipt left on a table. Necessary, routine. Her face brightened in a clear, ordinary way that made my chest fold inward. "Happy birthday," I said. She tore it open with the kind of efficient attention she applied to everything in her life. Quick, a little impatient, as if someone had somewhere else to be. 2 glossy cards slid from the envelope onto the tablecloth and shone up like small, ridiculous promises. I had spent months cashing in and moving numbers around in a way that made my savings look as if they had been a natural thing. I had told myself that was the point, to make the gift seamless, invisible. "Hawaii," she said, and for a moment she let the word hover between us like a kite. She held the ticket up for others to see, out of a reflex of inclusivity, then put it back on the table as if it belonged to the room, not to me. Her smile was quick, performative. "I know you mentioned wanting to go," I said. "Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dad." She tucked the ticket beside her water glass, turning almost immediately back to the woman on her left to finish a story about a client who'd worn flip-flops to a media meeting. Around the table, the conversation resumed. A few people looked at the tickets and then away, like they'd looked at something they were meant to glance past. Wallace picked up one of the cards and whistled low, admiration terse. "Nice, Alan. Must have cost a fortune. It sounded like the weather report, detached, competent. And then, like a door swinging inward in slow motion, she did it. "You know, Dad," Etta said, her voice carrying over the table with a niece confidence I'd forgotten she possessed, like someone reciting a line from a play she'd practiced in the mirror. "The best gift would be your disappearance. Seriously." Time fractured. A fork clinked, so small and brittle it sounded like a note breaking in the air. Someone attempted a laugh and then cut it off halfway, embarrassed by the length of it. Wallace's laugh came first, generous and loud like someone who'd been paid to be magnanimous at parties. A few faces went soft with the reflex of laughter. A few went sharp with the cruelty of a joke that lands at someone else's expense. My smile refused to go away. It was sticky and useless on my face, like an old mask that no longer fits but which you can't bear to drop. Inside my chest, something that could be described as anything from grief to a slow animal fear widened. Plastic warmth. The room seemed to tilt as if someone had nudged the table, and all the plates slanted slightly toward Etta, as if pulled by a gravity that was not mine. "You're being dramatic," she said after a beat, turning the moment into humor as an act of salvage. She picked up the ticket and slid it back into the envelope. "But sure, Hawaii, we'll use them." Friends smiled politely at that, but some had the small, thin look of people who've seen a minor wreck they politely cannot ignore. The blonde across the table, Josh's wife, picked at her napkin until the thread unspooled in a small gesture of having touched something uncomfortable. Someone whispered something about jobs and RSVPs. My cup of wine went untouched. Later, as the waiter cleared plates and the main courses arrived, the conversation parceled off into smaller islands. People leaned into their neighbors with the tactic of conviviality, speaking about the weather, about projects, about engagements. Once, in the middle of a laugh at a story I didn't follow, Ida reached across the table and brushed my sleeve with the back of her hand in a movement I couldn't read. It might have been affection. It might have been the automatic touch people give to an elder to locate them as part of a map. Her hand was warm, and for a moment I believed that we were connected. After dinner, the group moved like a single organism toward a bar that smelled of cinnamon and citrus. I watched from the edge as they rearranged themselves into new clusters. Ida was laughing at something Wallace had murmured. The laugh was small and perfect for the camera. Everyone's phones came out. Selfies were taken. Someone, of course someone, asked to post it on social media. A series of small fireworks went off across the table. On the walk home, the city felt kinder than the restaurant. The streetlights softened the world into a cinematic blur. People in jackets walked their dogs, hands in pockets, safe and purpose-built. My phone vibrated in my pocket. One message from Ida that had a washable brightness I couldn't interpret. "Thanks, Dad, X," was all it said. There was no exclamation, no lingering punctuation. A kind of gratitude that belonged more to a transaction than to an emotion. I slept badly that night, in a room that had always been more for me than for anyone else. The house sighed around me, the heater flipping on, the old pipes taking breath in the walls. The ticket envelope sat on the kitchen counter like a small, guilty thing. I poured coffee and daydreamed in a way that bordered on ritual, opening the door to the kitchen, collecting a loaf of bread. The fantasy of disappearing tasted sweet on my tongue, like candy I had no right to eat. It isn't that I was some hapless man abandoned by a family that forgot him. It was subtler, and it was worse. I had been reduced to a background fixture, the sort of thing you only notice when it warps or breaks. My presence had become an appliance, useful, expected, quietly resented when it malfunctioned. There are older men who collect men's club memberships like talismans. There are women who keep a list of movies to watch. Life had been rearranged into lists where my daughter's needs were the axis, and my own existence an incidental column. In the quiet of morning, the idea came not as a plan but as a possibility. Disappear. Leave. Be gone. It arrived like a stranger who stands in the doorway and waits to be invited in. I drank my coffee and watched the steam vanish into the air and felt the word on my tongue, warm and complete. I started small. I called the bank and asked about reassigning accounts without making a scene, memorized the scripts they fed me over the line. I made a list of things to sell, items that had weight and name recognition. I spent a Sunday morning on Craigslist like a man in training, learning the language of detachment that allowed people to assign value to objects and not to the memories tied to them. The house had been my anchor and my prison. It had held our family like a jar holds marbles, arranged neatly, colors separated, and when shaken, a noise no one wanted to listen to. Ida had always been practical to a fault, cataloging feelings into tasks. As a child, she used to make lists of presents she wanted for birthdays, folding paper back and forth with a concentration that made me laugh. As a teenager, she applied the same discipline to relationships. It was as if she believed that by organizing them, she could avoid being surprised. The thing that made it worse was that everything she did was an earnest attempt at happiness. She wanted comfort and clarity and a life that made sense in terms she could predict. I had tried for years to be the scaffolding that let her reach those places. But scaffolding rusts. People forget the orange paint on a scaffold before the metal corrodes. The moment of my breakdown wasn't a dramatic rupture so much as the slow erosion of attention. You should disappear, she had said. Not leave the dishes or stop calling. Those would be small, fixable things. She'd asked for an absence so total it could be a present. The cruelty of it was almost rational, like a finally definitive instruction manual. If you remove the undesirable element, the system works better. Legionality, as it turned out, was not the sticky web it felt like when the idea first sat in my head like a stone. There were papers that allowed transfer of property under specific circumstances, forms that let signatures move things from one person to another if the person signing was the legal owner. The house was mine. The bank account had my name on it. It felt obscene to discover how much of my life could be moved with pen strokes, how the present tense of legal ownership dissolved with a notary's ink. In one afternoon, I learned things that made me laugh and then made me weep, about the way systems assume trust and how trust can be manipulated with the neatness of a spreadsheet. The plook shaped like a machine assembling itself from spare parts. I would sell the house. I would transfer the money to an account under a different name. I would buy the cheapest ticket I could find to somewhere that wasn't here. I would write a letter that was not meanness, but an offering of truth. A document so carefully curated that its voice would carry like a bell in a room that had no windows. People ask, later, how you can do something like that to your child. They ask whether it's cruelty or cowardice. I don't have a neat answer. There is cruelty in revenge, and there is sorrow in erasure. But there's also a clarity that comes when you stop asking to be loved in terms you've been taught you should want. For years I had accepted the crumbs of civility and regarded them as affection when they were not. Disappearing felt like a refusal to be an incidental feature in someone else's life. It felt perversely like reclamation. The last week before I left, I learned to be fast and invisible. I took the train to the city courthouse and signed my name with a steady hand. I called an agent who knew how to handle sales with discretion. No open houses, no curious neighbors peering in. I listed the house with a price that would attract the right kind of buyer, the kind who wanted to renovate and didn't care about who used to inhabit the rooms. I packed a single bag. I left a key where Ida could find it if she needed to, beneath a loose brick at the back of the garden, the place she'd used to hide secrets as a child. And in the letter, I would explain that the key no longer opened anything meaningful. On the thunder the buyer signed, the house felt like a thing I had been allowed to borrow. The hardwood floors remembered the scuff of small feet. The kitchen kept the warmth of the oven for a long time after I turned it off. I walked through each room and touched the light switches like a pilgrim at a shrine, more mindful than I had any right to be. When the agent handed me the closing documents, he did it with the detached, professional warmth of someone used to death by paperwork. The pen in my hand trembled, but the signature was steady. I left the letter on the kitchen table like a stone left on a grave. I printed no drafts. I wrote in a single sitting at a kitchen table that had held our mornings. The letter was not a tirade. It was not rabid, nor did it try to be theatrical. It was precise, a list of facts woven with the innocence of someone exhausted by diplomacy. I wrote the ways the house had been bought, and what that meant for who could remain there. I wrote about money, cold numbers that would make a polite social circle tilt and look away. I wrote about Wallace with the ruthless clarity of someone who had watched and waited until evidence made a claim feel like an inevitable truth. I enclosed photographs I had collected without malice, only the careful eye of someone cataloging truth. When I sealed the envelope, I felt no joy. The motion was too quiet, like the closing of a book in a library where someone has died. I put the envelope in my pocket and walked down to the post office in a town that didn't know me. I mailed it with my full name and no return address. I bought a one-way ticket that fit the thinning of my courage. Cheap, functional, certain. On the morning I left for the airport, Ada sent a photo of a sunset in Hawaii. A postcard of palm fronds and a melting sky. Wallace's arm was around her shoulders in the snapshot, their heads tilted in practiced intimacy. She typed, "We're so happy. Thank you, Dad." There was once again no punctuation to suggest heat, misled, overcrowd. Would away from the curb and the house receded, I felt something like weight lift and something like loss fall in its place. Disappearing was not an absence as much as a reorientation. I stepped into the possibility of being someone else's memory. PEM. If someone had asked me then what I intended, I would have said, to be free of being ignored. I would have said, to let a truth land without the clutter of my presence making it strange. I would have said, to give her what she claims she wanted and to do it in the most honest way I knew how. I would not have said, to destroy. Destruction was a consequence I did not plan with glee. It arrived like fallout, an uninvited aftermath to a precisely aimed action. Ada's words, "The best gift would be your disappearance," had been spoken with the casual cruelty of someone who believes the world will always arrange itself to their advantage. They had been uttered as if the universe were a well-ordered store and she had only to leave the shelf to make space. I honored the phrasing. I disappeared because she asked me to. I left because it felt like the only thing I could offer that would meaningfully reorder the lives around me. I did it with the care of someone who knows how to tie knots that cannot easily be undone. I wrote the letter in a voice that was both confession and indictment, and I mailed it with the neat satisfaction of a final, terrible gift. On the plane, halfway across an ocean and nothing like the man who had climbed aboard in my city, I folded my hands and watched clouds like islands drift below. The noise in my ears was a low, continuous hum, and for the first time in years I could not hear the small, steady accusations of being insufficient. The hollow opened, and in the dark between sleep and wakefulness I thought, I have done what she wanted. Now I will find out what it costs. The first thing I did was make sure there was nothing dramatic about leaving. If you are going to erase yourself from a life, there are two ways to do it, with a headline or with a whisper. I chose the whisper. Headlines are for people who want to be remembered. I wanted to be forgotten. I started with the practical things, the way a man who has spent decades in the habit of maintenance notices the hinges before the portrait. I walked through the house with a clipboard and a pen, writing down what could be moved without raising eyebrows. The things that meant the most were often the least useful to anyone else. The chipped mug Ida had painted in second grade, the bookshelf of paperbacks I loved and no one read, the shoe tray by the back door with my outdoor boots. I took photographs of rooms as if I were cataloging an estate for someone I did not know. The images made everything feel smaller, flattened into rectangles that could be shipped and replaced. There was paperwork to untangle. The bank had to be navigated, not stormed. My accounts were in my name. Utilities were on my card. The real estate agent I called lived 3 towns away and had a voice as neutral as a courtroom's. He promised discretion, no realtor signs on the lawn, no open houses, a quiet handshake with a buyer who wanted a renovation project. He asked why I needed privacy. I told him the truth. I wanted a clean break. He didn't press. People in certain professions learn to keep their mouths closed like tools in a box. The house, he assured me, would be handled in a way that left no curious neighbors at the window. We can arrange a private showing, he said. We'll screen potential buyers. It will take a little longer, but you'll like the outcome. I liked the outcome less than I liked the absence it created. Sexism selling the house felt like disassembling a life. There were moments when my hands lingered over a countertop or paused on the banister as if touched by gravity. I stripped drawers of their sentimental clutter and boxed them with mechanical indifference. Each time I taped a lid closed, my chest tightened, as if I had sealed something that might never be opened again. I put the boxes in the garage and made a list of who would pick up what at what time. I learned the language of logistics and pretended it was a kind of ritual purification. Shieldsita texted me more in those days than she had in years. It was the sort of light contact that moves like static. A photo of a plate of food, a snap of sand and sky, a two-word message that said, "Wish you were here." I answered with short, encouraging replies. Enjoy, take photos, love you. The brevity was deliberate. It kept my face from becoming a presence she had to account for. She sent a video of her laughing with friends in a hotel bar and tagged Wallace in it. His smile was as smooth as the edges of a coin. I watched the clip 3 times and then deleted it. There was a careful, almost scientific cruelty in keeping distance. The process was mercilessly ordinary. A buyer signed forms with a pen that was rented from a bank, and signatures became an arithmetic that erased the house's name from a ledger. The agent did the heavy lifting of negotiation and schedules, and on the final morning, he met me with a folder and a cardboard coffee cup. The buyer, an enterprising couple who had read the house's bones and imagined something fashionable, was respectful and efficient. They wanted the bones. They did not want the memory, and watched the deed change hands. My name slid down a line of black ink, and the clerk's rubber stamp was a nail hitting a coffin. The lawyer said, "If you'd like, we can transfer funds to an account and arrange a wire." And I nodded because it was easier to nod than to argue with the way the world treated property like a commodity rather than an archive of small tragedies. Miguel a key where Ida might look for it, beneath a loose flagstone by the garden, the same place she had hidden notes as a child. And in the letter I would explain, simply, that the key no longer opened anything that mattered. I wanted her to be able to find something that felt familiar, if only to face its absence. It seemed, at the time, like an act of mercy. On the day the sale became final, the house felt empty in a way it had never felt with people in it, like a bell that had been struck and now waited for sound. I turned off the water, checked the boiler, and left a handful of everyday instructions folded into a neat sheet for anyone who would replace me. I closed the door and walked to the car without making a backward turn. My footsteps on the porch were deliberate. I did not want to look sentimental in the way an audience expects. At the airport, I sat with a coffee that had gone cold more quickly than I expected. People moved around me in the unquestioned choreography of leaves blown by wind, rolling suitcases, late kisses, the small panics of travel. I folded my hands on my bag and watched faces that were not mine for a while, wondering what it felt like to be free of the work of being present. Europe received me like an indifferent host. Paris smelled of rain and pastry and strangers who walked fast and spoke about art the way people in my town spoke about weather. I rented a room in a pension near the river and slept in a bed that had been new in another life. I spent mornings on benches, watching women walk dogs with the precise indifference of people who had chosen their own rhythms. I wandered into museums and stood in front of canvases longer than I ever stood in front of my daughter's face. Travis softened me and sharpened me in turns. There were moments of startling peace, the kind that felt as if it could not possibly belong to a person who had been so long unwitnessed. I sat on a tram in Prague as the morning light poured through the glass and thought about the small things that had accumulated like dust on the mantle of my life. I wrote notes in a journal I kept for the first time in years, not as a log, but as a conversation with myself. The entries started with neutral sentences. Bought bread, saw a woman with a blue scarf, and then, without fanfare, moved into reflections that had no audience. But I did not simply heal. My mind was busy with a different industry, the composition of the letter. In cheap hotels with thin walls, I wrote and rewrote the paragraphs until the voice felt like it belonged to my hand rather than to my outrage. The letter had to be clear. It had to be precise. It had to land like a fact, inevitable, unemotional, incapable of being misread as a plea. I included dates, figures, and copies of documents. I described, with the bluntness of someone who had spent months accumulating evidence, the transfers and arrangements that meant the house could be sold without her consent. I assembled photographs, Wallace with his arm around a woman who was not Ida, receipts, a ledger that proved what my instincts and suspicions had already shown me. I did not write to wound for the sake of wounding. I wrote to show the truth behind the pleasant surface she adored. Sometimes, late at night, I would think of the 1,000 small compromises that had stacked into the evening at the restaurant. I remembered how her voice had carried across the table, as if she had been speaking from a height. I remembered the way the room had rallied at her laugh, and the way the faces had looked away when something sharp had landed. Memory is a cunning architect. It takes small offenses and builds them into cathedrals of betrayal. My letter would be the demolition crew. Weeks stretched on and the date of her return approached. I had imagined many scenarios but refused to rehearse any of them too fully. Speculation would turn the whole thing into theater, and I wanted the truth to land with the coldness of a fact, not with the fever of performance. In the small hours before dawn, sitting at a cafe table and watching a city unclench, I put the final paragraph on the page, a sentence that began, simply, "You asked me to disappear." It was not a gloating line. It was a factual one. Withdrawing mailed the envelope. I did it from a post office 2 streets away from the pension where I was staying. The clerk did not ask questions. He stamped the letter and slid it away like someone performing a mechanical kindness. I felt the motion as if I were sealing a small machine I had assembled. Tension threaded through paper and ink. Ida Return was a photograph of light and leisure. Her social media feed brimmed with curated joy, cocktail pictures, palm trees, and hotel balconies. She posted a photo of a sunset with Wallace's silhouette in the foreground and captioned it with a heart. She had intended to show me, and the world, the life she loved. She wanted confirmation that the ticket had been the right thing, that a gift could be both extravagant and untroubling. I watched the stream of images like someone skimming a book I had once loved. The morning she came back, my phone was quiet in a way I did not expect. I had imagined frantic calls, a barrage of anger, or at least the urgent petition of a child surprised by loss. Instead, there was nothing. The silence sounded like judgment. The absence of notification felt like a small, precise verdict. Then the messages began. Not from Ida at first. Her friends texted. Then a neighbor I had once helped shovel the driveway. Curiosity rippled outwards in small questions. The first voicemail was a neutral, clipped request. Could I please call about the house? The second message contained a number for a person claiming to be from the bank. The third was an automated prompt from a credit institution. Each one landed with the same mechanical insistence. Attention required. It was a photo of the front yard with a small sign planted where the "For Sale" placard had been. Only now it read, "Sold," in a typeface that did not care for sentiment. The next message was a screenshot of a bank statement with numbers highlighted. I sat in a rented room surrounded by unfamiliar curtains and watched the screen as if it were a theater. The world closed in on a single nervous pixel. Ida called once and left a voice message that sounded small and stunned. "Dad," she said, and the name had the fragile sound of someone holding a glass that had just slipped. "Dad, where are you?" She did not accuse. She did not shout. There was a breath at the end of the message like someone trying to find their balance. I read the message twice and then put the phone face down. There was no pride in that act, only an odd instinct to let the sound rest somewhere private. I did not call back. Calling back would have reinserted me into a narrative I had chosen to leave. Copyright, in a hotel room that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and lemon. I opened the news app on my phone and found nothing about us. Nobody writes headlines for domestic exits like mine unless a neighbor decides the story is juicy. The destruction I'd set in motion was not dramatic. It was administrative and precise, like oil spill containment rather than an explosion. But destruction at the level of personal lives has a slow motion all its own. It does its worst, not in the moment of collapse, but in the steady evaporation of reputation, relationships, and little conveniences. I slept poorly, the letter like a stone pinned somewhere behind my ribs. I wondered, not for the first time, whether I had been cruel or whether I had finally, at last, enacted a necessary truth. There was a chisel feeling to the act, an instrument of separation that cuts and leaves edges raw and honest. Somewhere between regret and relief, I found a strange steadiness. I had become an audience of one to the life I had once held close. In that small, odd solitude, I began to understand that disappearing does not end the story. It rearranges it. It offers new chapters we do not get to choose the shape of. Slamming the weapon, the street lamps blinked awake across the foreign city. A tram rattled somewhere in the distance. I folded my hands and let the sound settle into me, patient as a tide. The next morning I would wake early and make coffee in a new cafe and try to be a man who had learned how to witness himself without the permission of another. The letter was mailed. The house was sold. One had been an action. The other was an insistence that now the consequences be faced without me in the room. The first morning I woke up in Europe, it was in a narrow apartment above a cafe in Lisbon. The air smelled like burnt espresso and sea salt. For the first time in years, I didn't hear Ida slamming the front door, or Wallace's synthetic laughter echoing from my kitchen. I heard seagulls and the low murmur of the city waking up. I sat by the window, watching the pale light spread across the cobblestone streets, and realized something almost frightening. I didn't miss home. Not the creaking stairs, not the silent dinners, not the house that had slowly become hers. The freedom was dizzying. It tasted like black coffee after years of drinking lukewarm tap water. That day, through markets and side streets, past walls painted in bright chipped tiles, I bought a small notebook from a street vendor, its cover wrapped in cracked leather. I didn't know why, but I felt an urge to start writing again. Not emails, not bills, not the kind of polite, functional notes life forces you to produce, but something real. That night, I began my first entry. Day 1. She said to disappear. I think I'm finally doing it properly. Over the next few weeks, I drifted across Europe like a ghost, slowly remembering how to breathe. I took trains instead of flights, shared meals with strangers in crowded hostels, and walked miles just to watch the sun set from different hills. I was invisible, and for once, I didn't mind. I spent an afternoon in the Prado Museum. I stood in front of Goya's Saturn devouring his son far too long, the father's wild eyes, the horror frozen mid-act. It made me think of Ida again, not in hatred, but in something worse, understanding. Maybe I had failed her long before she failed me. Maybe love, when held too tightly, eats itself alive. That night I wrote again. Day 14. She humiliated me, but maybe I taught her how. She only reflected what I gave her, silence, distance, disappointment. But I still can't forgive her. Not yet. I didn't realize then that I was building towards something, that every observation, every late-night confession scribbled in that notebook was slowly shaping the words that would one day destroy her peace. In Paris, I stayed for almost a month. The city was expensive, loud, and indifferent, which suited me perfectly. I found a small cafe near Montmartre that didn't care if I sat there for hours, so long as I kept a cup of coffee on the table. The owner, a woman named Solène, reminded me of Ida's mother. She had the same kind of quiet strength that made people listen when she spoke softly. Solène would sometimes join me during her breaks. She'd ask about my writing, and I told her bits and pieces, how I used to work in architecture, how I had a daughter who wanted me gone. She didn't pity me. She just nodded and said, Maybe she needs to lose you to understand you. Those words sat with me like a stone in my chest. Maybe that was what I needed too, to lose myself before I could ever face her again. Every morning I wrote a little more, my notebook filled with fragments, thoughts, memories, and letters I'd never sent. By the third week, those fragments began to take form. I wrote the first draft of the letter on a cold morning while rain streaked the windows and the city blurred outside. Ida, you wanted me gone. Consider this your wish granted. By the time you read this, everything you thought was yours will no longer be. I am not angry anymore. I am free. From Paris, I took a train to Florence. The landscape outside the window rolled like a memory. Fields, rivers, small towns with church towers piercing the horizon. It felt almost cinematic, as if life was mocking me for ever believing it was dull. In Florence, I stayed in a modest hotel with creaking floors and a view of the Arno. The city was alive with art and ghosts of people who had done terrible things in the name of beauty. I walked through galleries filled with saints, martyrs, and sinners immortalized in paint. Every face looked like confession. At night, I sat by the window and continued the letter. It grew darker, more honest. I stopped writing for her approval and started writing for my own closure. Every sentence peeled away another layer of resentment until I could finally see the truth underneath. I didn't hate Ida for humiliating me. I hated myself for raising her to think love was transactional. Stiffness, still, I couldn't let her walk away untouched. Forgiveness and consequence, I decided, could coexist. One evening, I stumbled into a tiny bookstore tucked in a side street near Ponte Vecchio. The shopkeeper, an old man with a sharp tongue, asked where I was from. When I told him America, he laughed and said, "You people think running away changes the story. It only changes the scenery." That night, I dreamt of my old house, of Ida sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, never once looking up. I saw Wallace's smirk, that smug tilt of his head. I woke up sweating, my heart racing. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat down, and finished the first clean draft of the letter. It wasn't angry anymore. It was cold, deliberate, precise. Ida, you told me to disappear. I took your advice. The house, the money, the memories, they're all gone. I've left you something, though. A truth that will hurt more than my absence ever could. By the time I left Florence, I was no longer Alan the father or Alan the failure. I was simply Alan, a man who had chosen to stop waiting for gratitude, for love that wasn't coming. I mailed the letter the day before I left Italy. I remember standing at the post office counter, the same heavy envelope in my hand. I felt the same way I had at her birthday dinner, except this time, the weight didn't scare me. It grounded me. Insurance, as the clerk took it and stamped it, I smiled. It would take a week to reach her. By then, she'd be back from Hawaii, still sunburned from the vacation I paid for. Teeth Federation. That night, I watched the sunset over the Arno River, the sky painted gold and violet. I raised my glass of cheap wine and whispered to the empty air, to freedom, and to the end of pretending. The morning I decided to seal the letter, Florence was wrapped in fog. The city felt half asleep, as if holding its breath. I sat at the small wooden desk in my hotel room, staring at the pages spread before me. The words I had written over the past month lay in uneven stacks, fragments of guilt, rage, and truth. Now I had to decide which of them would make it into the final version, the one that would cross an ocean and land in Ida's trembling hands. Dismissing. I remember my pen trembling as I wrote the date at the top. April 16th, Florence, Italy. Then, slowly, carefully, I began. Ida, missions. You once raised your glass and said the best gift I could give you was to disappear. So, here it is. Your wish, wrapped neatly in a white envelope. You won't find me where you left me, and you won't find what you think belongs to you, because it never did. GM bells slightly through the paper. I paused, looking out the window at the cathedral dome, a faint silhouette through the mist. My chest tightened, but not with regret. It was relief. For the first time in years, I was speaking to her honestly. Intuitions. I continued writing. I bought that house for your mother when we were young and foolish enough to believe that walls could keep people happy. She loved that place, every inch of it. The garden, the window seat, even the creaky stairs you used to slide down when you were little. Sluggish. When she died, something in both of us broke, didn't it? I thought I could fix it by giving you everything she left behind. I signed over the car, the savings account, the college fund. I told myself that love meant providing, even when you stopped saying thank you. But it wasn't love. It was guilt. And guilt turns generosity into a leash. I took a sip of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The bitterness suited the moment. I shuffled through another stack of papers. Copies of bank transfers, property documents, old emails between Wallace and his business associate, who was actually Ida's best friend, Lila. I'd found them by accident one sleepless night, scrolling through my phone when I still lived in that house. Ida had used my old laptop once, never realizing her cloud account synced automatically. I remember the first line of one of those messages. Signing. He doesn't even know how lucky he is, being with you. Should ever have to read something like that. Not about his daughter, not from the man who sits across from him at dinner pretending to be decent. I attached a printed copy of that email to the back of the letter. Then I wrote the next part. You think Wallace loves you. Maybe he does, in the way a man loves an opportunity. You never saw how his eyes changed when he spoke about your inheritance. You never noticed the way he laughed when you mocked me, as if you were performing for him. There's something you should know about Wallace. He isn't who you think he is. I hired someone to look into him after that dinner. I wanted to know the man who could laugh at another person's humiliation. The truth was worse than I imagined. He has debts, Ida, big ones, and he's been using your name on more than one account. That business trip to Miami, it wasn't business. It was damage control. You might want to call your bank. You'll find withdrawals you didn't authorize. I set the pen down and rubbed my eyes. It wasn't easy writing this, not because it hurt her, but because it forced me to admit how blind I had been. I let her surround herself with people who fed on her arrogance because I didn't have the strength to confront her sooner. Expelled now, I was doing it from across an ocean. I resumed writing. I'm not angry at you anymore, Ida. Not really. I was, for a long time. But then I realized anger still ties me to you, and I don't want that. I've sold the house, the one you said would be yours someday. The papers are finalized, the money transferred. It was all under my name. You never bothered to check. I gave a portion to a charity your mother used to support. The rest I'll use to live quietly, somewhere far from the noise. You'll never find where. That's the point. As I wrote, I could almost hear her voice, the sharpness, the disbelief, the furious denial. I imagined her reading the letter in her spotless apartment, Wallace hovering behind her shoulder, his mask cracking as she reached the final pages. I smiled. For once, the thought didn't fill me with guilt. It filled me with peace. I slid the photos into the envelope next. They were old printouts, grainy but unmistakable. Wallace and Lila together at a resort 2 months before Ida's birthday. I didn't need to include a caption. The truth didn't require commentary. Then I added the last page, the heart of the letter, the part that would finish what her birthday toast had started. I kept one final secret, Ida, one I never told you because I didn't trust what you'd do with it. Your mother didn't leave me much, but she did leave a trust. It was meant for you, once you learned to stand on your own. I waited, hoping that day would come. But after that night, after your words, I knew it wouldn't. So I redirected it. The entire trust, every cent, now funds a scholarship in your mother's name for children who have no parents to embarrass them in restaurants. You told me to disappear, and I did. But disappearing isn't the same as dying. I'll live well, quietly, knowing I finally did one thing right. When you look in the mirror, I hope you see not a victim, but a lesson. When I finished the letter, the sun had risen, filling the room with pale gold. My hand ached from writing, my eyes burned, but I felt light. lighter than I had in years. I read the pages once more, then folded them neatly, pressing them flat as if sealing the past itself. The envelope looked ordinary, white, harmless, unremarkable. But inside it was everything she never expected. The truth, the reckoning, the closure she had demanded without understanding what it meant. Before sealing it, I added one final line at the bottom. P.S. You once said you'd be happier if I vanished. Be careful what you wish for, Ida. Sometimes wishes come true, but not in the way you expect. I walked to the nearest post office just after noon. The city had come alive, tourists flooding the streets, church bells ringing in the distance. I moved through them unseen, a shadow with a purpose. Inside the post office, the air smelled of dust and old paper. I bought international postage, wrote her address in my neat, deliberate handwriting, and handed it to the clerk. She smiled without knowing she was holding the end of something much larger than herself. As the clerk stamped the envelope, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not triumph, not vengeance, but release. Dismissing from my hands and vanished behind the counter. It was gone, carried into the machinery of fate. I stepped outside into the Florentine sunlight and breathed deeply. The bells of Santa Maria del Fiore tolled noon. I stood there, eyes closed, listening to them fade. Them again, I felt like a man reborn. Not a father, not a victim, not a ghost, but someone free of the past. I knew the letter would take about a week to reach her. I imagined the scene, the moment she found it in her mailbox, the hesitation before opening it, the shock that would ripple through her life like a quiet explosion. Maybe she would cry. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she would hate me forever. That was fine. Hate is still a kind of connection, but distance turns it hollow. For me, there was no hate left, only distance. Night, I sat at a small restaurant by the river and ordered a glass of wine. The waiter asked if I was celebrating. I thought for a moment before answering. I said softly, I think I finally gave her the gift she wanted. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, a letter began its journey toward the person who once wished I would disappear, carrying with it the weight of everything I had ever failed to say. The first thing Ida noticed when the plane wheels hit the tarmac wasn't the jolt or the hiss of the engines. It was the silence from Wallace. He'd barely spoken the entire flight home from Hawaii, and when he did, it was clipped, mechanical, like someone performing the role of boyfriend with the wrong script. She told herself it was jet lag. It had to be. After all, they'd just spent 7 days in paradise. Long sunsets, ocean waves, and perfectly filtered Instagram photos that had already racked up thousands of likes. Everything had looked perfect online. It had to be perfect in real life, too. But as the plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off, she glanced at him again. Wallace was already scrolling through his phone, jaw tight, eyes cold. When she asked, "Are you even listening to me?" he didn't answer. That was the first crack. They took a cab home. Ida leaned her head against the window, half asleep, dreaming of her shower, her bed, her house, her house. She pictured stepping through the door, the smell of lavender candles, the familiar creak of the stairs. Maybe her dad had watered the plants while she was gone. She almost laughed at the thought. No, of course he hadn't. That man barely managed to take care of himself, much less her succulents. When the taxi turned onto Maple Drive, her smile faded. The house didn't look right. At first, she thought she'd gotten the wrong street. The garden fence was gone, replaced with a fresh white one. The mailbox was different. But then she saw it, the tall oak tree out front, the one she used to climb as a kid. It was the same house, except for the giant "Sold" sign stuck into the front yard. Security was absurdly hopeful. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the realtor had posted the wrong sign. She paid the driver, dragging her suitcase across the sidewalk. Wallace followed behind her, not saying a word. When she reached for the doorknob, her hand froze. The key didn't fit. She tried again, harder this time. Nothing. "What the hell?" she muttered, jiggling the knob. Wallace stood a few steps back, arms folded. Maybe he changed the locks, he offered dryly. Ida turned to him, her voice rising. Why would he do that? This is my house. He shrugged, but his tone carried something smug beneath it. You sure about that? That was when she noticed the moving van across the street, the couple unloading boxes. Her chest tightened as she approached. Excuse me, what's going on? Why is that sign there? Mid-30s and sweating under the afternoon sun, looked confused. Oh, we just bought this place. Closed last week. Beautiful home. You the previous owner? Ida blinked. No, I mean, my father. She stopped. Man smiled politely, clearly uncomfortable. Well, congratulations to him, I guess. Market's crazy right now. She walked away before he could finish, her heart hammering. Wallace leaned against the car, sunglasses hiding his eyes. You want to tell me what's going on? I don't know, she snapped. He wouldn't sell it. He couldn't. But even as she said it, something cold began to crawl up her spine. Her father had been off lately, quiet, strange. The way he'd smiled at her during her birthday dinner, that too polite grin. The way he hadn't fought back when she'd made that cruel joke. He'd been planning something. The next hour calling his number, straight to voicemail. Then she called the bank. After waiting on hold for 20 minutes, the clerk finally came on the line. Yes, Miss Barnes, I see here that property was listed under Mr. Alan Barnes' sole ownership. The sale was completed 9 days ago. Funds were deposited into his personal account. What account? She demanded. Immigration. I'm sorry, that information is restricted. Ida hung up and stared at the phone like it had betrayed her. Wallace was sitting on the curb staring at his shoes. Shells. He really sold it, he said finally. Ida felt dizzy. He can't just, that house was supposed to be mine. Wallace didn't respond. He just kept staring at the ground. Windshield. And she looked closer. She noticed a flicker of something in his expression. Not shock, not anger. It looked almost like fear. They checked into a hotel that night. Ida barely spoke during the drive. She spent hours scrolling through her phone, searching for clues. Emails, texts, anything that might explain what her father had done. That was when she saw it. A new message in her inbox. Missions. IFIX. From alan.barnes@protonmail.com. Sim. Disruptions. For when you return. Stringent. Her breath caught. She clicked it open. The email was short. Shoreline. There's a letter waiting for you at your apartment. Expelled it alone. No signature. Aggression. Rarely. Just her father's name in the sender line. And a timestamp from 4 days ago. Ida didn't sleep that night. Her mind raced through memories. The birthday dinner, the laughter, the way her father's eyes had looked like glass when she'd made her toast. She remembered saying it so casually, like a punchline. The best gift would be for you to disappear. Unrestricted. And he had. She couldn't stand the waiting. She and Wallace drove straight to her apartment downtown. When she opened the door, she saw the envelope immediately, sitting neatly on the kitchen counter, beside the vase she'd left empty. Her name was written across it in her father's tidy handwriting. Just seeing it made her stomach twist. She reached for it slowly, almost reverently, like it might burn her. Wallace stood behind her. What is it? I don't know, she whispered. She broke the seal. Inside were several sheets of paper, a few folded documents, and, most chilling of all, photographs. The first line of the letter froze her blood. You told me the best gift would be for me to disappear, so I did. Her eyes scanned the rest, every sentence hitting harder than the last. He'd sold the house, taken the money, donated the inheritance. And then she saw them, the photos. Wallace, Lila, together, on the beach, in the same resort she and Wallace had just visited. Her hands began to shake. What is this? Relieved. Wallace's voice cracked. Ida, I can explain. Thrown on him, her voice raw. You cheated on me. You cheated on me? He didn't answer, and that was answer enough. Him, her voice breaking into a scream. You used me. Both of you. Ragass tried to grab her arm. Listen, it wasn't like that. Get out! He hesitated. Get out! She roared, hurling the vase against the wall. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. He left without another word. When the door slammed, the silence was deafening. Etta sank to the floor, clutching the letter. Her father's words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She read the last line again and again, until it branded itself into her mind. Freedom always has a cost. Outside, the city moved on, cars passing, people laughing, life continuing as if nothing had happened. But inside that apartment, Etta's world had collapsed. The father she'd mocked was gone. The man she'd loved had betrayed her. The future she'd planned had evaporated like smoke. She sat there for hours, the papers scattered around her like broken glass. It wasn't until nightfall that she finally stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. Her reflection stared back, pale, hollow-eyed, older than she remembered. "Bad," she whispered, voice trembling. "What did you do to me?" But there was no answer. Only the hum of the street below and the soft rustle of the letter in her shaking hands. That night, for the first time in her life, Etta didn't post a single photo, didn't text a single friend. She sat alone in her perfect room. She sat alone in her perfect silence, clutching the letter from the man she'd wished away, and realizing too late that she'd gotten exactly what she asked for. The postmark on the envelope read Lisbon, though by then I'd already moved on to Rome. I never expected her to respond, and she didn't, not directly. But when I dropped that letter into the red mailbox outside my hostel, I knew I was sealing more than paper. I was sealing our past. Inside it were words she was never meant to read from a father, yet I wrote them with a calmness that frightened me. The best gift I could give you was to disappear. Profitability, considered this your wish fulfilled. The house is gone. The money is gone. What you built your little life on, your comfort, your foundation, it was all mine. You didn't just inherit my name, you lived off my sacrifices. And now, I've taken it back. You wanted freedom? Now you have it. No walls, no debts, no roof. Start from nothing, like I once did. Let's see what you can build without me. It wasn't spite that wrote those words, it was exhaustion. Decades of trying to be loved by someone who saw me as a burden. I spent that night sitting by the Tagus River, watching the moon ripple over black water. I thought about the day she was born, how tiny her fingers had been, how she'd clutched mine like I was her whole world. Somewhere between then and now, I had lost her. Or maybe she'd just grown into someone I could no longer recognize. A week later, I got the first email. It wasn't from Ida, it was from Wallace. "What the hell did you do, Alan? She's losing her mind. You didn't just sell the house, you cleared the joint account. You left nothing. She's been calling the bank non-stop. Do you have any idea what this is doing to her?" I stared at the message for a long time, rereading every word. Then I deleted it. He didn't know about the second letter, the one I'd left taped to the realtor's file, marked, "To be delivered upon sale." That one contained something much worse, the truth. The truth about her mother. For years, Ida believed her mother had died suddenly from illness. What she never knew was that her mother had been planning to leave us. She drained the accounts, packed her things, and written a goodbye letter I intercepted before she could send it. The night before she vanished, I confronted her. Words turned into screams, screams into silence. She left before dawn, and a week later her car was found at the bottom of a ravine. Ida grew up thinking it was an accident. I let her believe that lie because it was easier than watching her hate both of us. But I couldn't carry it anymore. The second letter explained everything. The affair, the argument, the final night. When Ida read it, I imagined the world she'd built, her version of truth, splintered apart. Because every daughter wants to believe her mother was a saint and her father was the villain. I took that illusion from her. In a small cafe in Florence, I saw her face again, on my phone screen. Someone had tagged a local news outlet. Local marketing executive steps down amid family scandal. There she was, looking hollowed out, her eyes rimmed red. The caption mentioned, "Financial loss, emotional breakdown, and Public controversy following leaked family correspondence. I closed my phone and finished my espresso. It wasn't triumph I felt, not revenge, just peace. I mailed one last postcard that night. No return address, just a single sentence scrawled in black ink. Dismiss, Ida. Exactly like you asked. Then I dropped it into the postbox and walked away, not looking back. The streetlights glowed like distant stars over the cobblestones, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like anyone's father. I was just a man, quiet, free, and finally invisible. I was living in a small village outside Florence when she found me, a place where the hills rolled like sleeping giants and the air smelled of olives and rain. I had been there for almost 3 months, renting a single room above a cafe owned by an old woman who spoke no English but always smiled when she handed me my morning espresso. Life had become simple. Quiet mornings, long walks, no reminders of who I used to be. Until the day she arrived. I was sitting outside the cafe, a notebook open in front of me, when a taxi stopped at the corner. The door opened and Ida stepped out. For a moment, she didn't see me. She stood there in her black coat, looking around like someone had dropped her in the middle of a dream. Her hair was shorter now, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, but I knew her instantly. When her gaze finally landed on me, she froze. "Dad," she said. Her voice cracked on that single word. It was the first time she'd called me that in years. She didn't move. I wanted to, but my body refused. She crossed the narrow street, stopping just short of the table. I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Sit." Shameful. She sat. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we'd never said. "I read your letters," she said finally. I nodded. "I figured you would," emphasized. "Why would you do that to me?" Her voice was calm, but her fingers trembled around the edge of her sunglasses. "Why destroy everything? The house, the money, my job." "You told me to disappear," I said softly. "So I did." "That was a joke," she snapped, her voice rising. "At dinner, God, everyone was drunk. I didn't mean it." "Maybe not," I said, "but you meant the rest of it. The way you looked at me like I was some burden. The way you only called when you needed something. You didn't want a father, Ida. You wanted an ATM that said I love you on the receipt." She flinched. I saw the anger drain from her face, replaced by something else. Regret, maybe, or guilt. She written. "And the second letter," she whispered, "about Mom?" I looked down at the table. "You deserve to know the truth." Her hands curled into fists. "The truth? You ruined her memory. You made her sound like a monster." "She wasn't," I said. "She was human. She was lonely. So was I. But she didn't die because of me, Ida. She died because she couldn't bear the lie she'd built. I just didn't want you to become her." Turbulence welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You could have told me. You could have talked to me." "I tried," I said quietly. "For years." Dismissing stretched again. The cafe owner came out smiling and set down 2 cappuccinos. Ida stared at the foam swirling on top of hers, then reached into her bag. She pulled out the postcard I'd sent, the one that said, "I disappeared, Ida, exactly like you asked." She placed it between us. "You really thought this was what I wanted?" Unless I didn't answer. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "You broke me, Dad. But maybe I needed that. Maybe I needed to see what I'd turned into." Her voice softened. "I sold everything else. The car, the jewelry. I paid off the debts. I'm leaving too. Somewhere far. I don't know where yet." Trembling smile tugged at my mouth. "Then maybe we're more alike than I thought." Relinquop, slipping the postcard back into her bag. "Goodbye, Dad." "Goodbye, Ida." She turned and walked away, her figure shrinking as she disappeared down the winding street. I watched until she vanished into the sunlight. For a long time I sat there, staring at her empty cup. Then I reached for my notebook and wrote a single line across the page. Crimson. Sometimes love doesn't end in forgiveness. It ends in understanding. Anthem. Trage. When I closed the notebook, I realized I was crying. Not out of sadness, but out of something cleaner, lighter, maybe freedom. UN. That night, I packed my things. At dawn, I boarded a train heading north. I didn't know where it would take me, and for once, I didn't care. Behind me lay a life built on silence and guilt. Ahead, perhaps, a chance to start again. Restless. As the train pulled away, I looked out the window and whispered, non-existent, his happy birthday, Ida. And for the first time, it didn't hurt anymore.